Have you ever thought about the Bible not as this big book of rules or just a bunch of the nice quotes, but as one single epic story? A story with a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, today, that's exactly what we're diving into. We're going to see how viewing scripture as one grand narrative, what some call a meta story, can totally transform how we see ourselves, our struggles, and, frankly, how we care for each other. So, how does this one little shift in perspective actually work? Let's get into it. Okay, so it all starts with how our brains are built. I mean, we are literally wired for stories. There's this incredible research from a neuroscientist at Princeton, Yuri Hassan, and he found something that just blew my mind. When one person tells a story, the brain of the person listening actually starts to sync up with the storyteller's brain. It's wild. It's not just about hearing words. The storyteller is, in a way, planting ideas and emotions right into your mind. This creates this incredibly powerful connection, something that most other ways of communicating just can't touch. And the effects that stories have on us, they're really deep, right down to the neurological level. Stories with strong characters can actually trigger the release of oxytocin. That's the chemical that makes us feel empathy and connection. And get this, just sharing our own stories can switch off stress hormones like cortisol and release healing ones instead, like dopamine and oxytocin. But maybe the most important thing is how stories reassure us. They give us this coherent plot for our lives, helping us understand where we came from and where we're going. It gives us a stable sense of who we are. So, okay, if stories in general are that powerful, what happens when we engage with one of the most influential stories ever told? Let's zoom in on the biblical meta-story. And we're not going to treat it like a bunch of separate books, but as one single unified drama. And really, this brings us to two totally different ways of looking at scripture. On one side, you've got the book of rules approach, right? Just a bunch of isolated moral instructions and disconnected examples, a big list of do's and don'ts. This way of thinking can lead to a lot of moralism and you totally miss the big picture. But on the other side, a much, much more powerful idea, a unified story, a coherent drama with one single redemptive plot running through it all. And trust me, seeing it this way changes everything. So what's the plot of this grand story? Well, you can think of it in 5 major acts. Act 1, creation, a good world made with purpose. Act 2, the fall, where all that goodness gets fractured. Then, Act 3, the covenant. This is God's persistent relational promise to his people, even in all the brokenness. That leads us to Act 4, redemption, which is the climax of the whole drama. And finally, it all points toward Act 5, ultimate restoration. See, it's not just a random collection of events. It's a clear, consistent storyline. And here's the absolute crucial point. This grand narrative, it's the lens for our own lives. It gives us a framework to find meaning, to find hope, and even to understand our suffering. Suddenly, our personal struggles aren't just random, meaningless events anymore. They get reframed. They become part of a much bigger story that's actually moving toward redemption and restoration. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how do we know this is one unified story? Aren't we just kind of forcing that idea onto the text? Well, what's so fascinating is that the original language of the Old Testament, Biblical Hebrew, actually has these powerful clues baked right in that weave the whole story together. Yeah, the very building blocks of the language itself help preserve this continuity. When you look at the original text, you start to see these thematic links that often get lost in translation. For instance, the Hebrew word for covenant shows up way back in Genesis with Abraham, and then you hear it echoing through the prophets, connecting parts of the story across hundreds, even thousands of years. It's like the language itself makes sure you never lose the plot. Let's take that word for example. The Hebrew word is berit, and it means covenant. Now, in English, covenant can sound a little, dry and legalistic, like a contract. But in the biblical story, it's this incredibly powerful theme. It stands for God's unbreakable, relational commitment. And it just shows up again and again and again, tying the entire story together, all the way from Abraham right into the New Testament. And berit isn't the only one. There are all these other critical narrative threads woven through the text. Words like hesed, this idea of steadfast, loyal love, and amunah, which means faithfulness. These aren't just abstract theological ideas. They're like recurring motifs that remind us of God's character throughout the story. Or take Goel, redeemer. That's the word used to describe what Boaz does in the story of Ruth, right? He steps in and rescues a family from ruin. Well, fast forward centuries, and the prophet Isaiah uses that exact same word to describe God as the ultimate rescuer of his people. The story is literally echoing itself. So when you start to see the text this way, you realize how all this thematic repetition is constantly reinforcing the main plot points. It's honestly a brilliant literary strategy. It makes sure that the audience, generation after generation, never loses sight of the central story. Okay, so we've got this grand, unified story held together by these amazing linguistic threads. But so what? Why does this matter for the messy, complicated reality of our actual lives? Well, this is where this whole framework moves from an ancient text to modern-day care. It completely reframes the goal of counseling. It's not about just fixing problems anymore. It's about shepherding a person back into their rightful place in God's story. Think about it. A problem-focused approach tends to zero in on specific behaviors, right? It offers advice that can feel kind of fragmented. And it can, even unintentionally, make people feel like they're just broken rule breakers that need to be fixed. But a story-formed approach, it's so different. It tries to locate a person within God's bigger narrative. It gets to the deeper questions. Who am I? What's my purpose? It sees people not as problems to be solved, but as image bearers who are in the process of being restored. You know, so many of the issues we face, shame, despair, trauma, addiction, at their core, they're what you could call a narrative crisis. This is what happens when a person's own life story just breaks down. They've lost the plot. They don't have a coherent sense of who they are or where their life is headed anymore. And this kind of narrative crisis can lead to what the therapist D.W. Winnicott called the false self. When our own inner story feels broken or unsafe, we might build a fake one to protect ourselves. You know, a persona that just adapts to what everyone else wants, that pleases people, but it isn't who we really are. We end up living someone else's story instead of the one we were meant to live. This is where the power of the biblical meta-story just comes roaring to life. It offers a true, solid narrative to replace the broken or false one. By finding our place, our small personal story, within God's grand redemptive story, our identity is restored. Suddenly, we're not defined by our failures or our pain. We're defined by our role in His story. And the Bible is filled with these patterns. You can almost think of them as templates that help us make sense of what we're going through. Feeling lost or alone, there's a pattern in the story for exile and return. Facing a devastating loss, there's a pattern for death and renewal. When it feels like God is silent, guess what? There's a pattern for silence followed by defined speech. These narrative arcs give us a language for our experiences and a reason for hope. They give us permission to be honest about our pain while staying anchored in God's faithfulness. So when it comes down to it, this whole narrative approach to counseling is just deeply compassionate. It protects people from the kind of spiritual harm that can happen with shaming or heavy-handed moralism or simplistic one-size-fits-all solutions. It honors the complexity and the messiness of life in a broken world, all while holding on tightly to the hope of a redemptive story. So I want to leave you with this question to think about. What if your life isn't a problem to be solved? What if it's a story to be lived? A story that's finding its true meaning inside of a much grander, more beautiful, and ultimately a redemptive narrative. Just thinking about that one little shift can change absolutely everything.